our 2013 commemoration of Constitution Day. I've been asked to make an announcement. If you are in Dr. Hendricks's class in Education 260, if you would please make sure to sign in at the sign-in sheet in the back before you leave or right now, so that you can get ready for attendance. And I'd also like to introduce our guest speaker for today, Mr. Nimrod Chappell, who I asked a few weeks ago to come and speak at Constitution Day for us, and I asked him if he wouldn't mind sending me his resume so I could put together a nice flyer announcing his presence. And he sent me something that he called a resume, but it was actually a novella. It was a very lengthy packet of information, and so I cannot even attempt to try and describe everything that Nimrod Chappell has done. He has served in a number of state institutions, which are really cool jobs. They allow him to help a lot of people around the state who would otherwise be unable to help themselves. He's published widely on a number of different legal topics regarding issues in Missouri today, as well as serving as our local president of the chapter of the NAACP. But as I was putting all this together, I realized that I knew Nimrod Chappell in another context. I knew him not as Nimrod Chappell, legal scholar, but as Nim's dad. His son and my son both went to the same school. On several occasions, Mr. Chappell offered to help drive my son and myself up the snowy hill on the way to school. So I know him in an entirely different context, and I was reminded of just how small a town Jefferson City is. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Nimrod Chappell.
Hey, thank you, Mark. I certainly appreciate that kind introduction. Just a second here, we can organize. How's everybody doing this morning? Great. Good, good. I'm glad to hear it. And I'm glad to see you here, too. Not only because me giving a speech or a talk about the Constitution to myself would be worse than boring, but because I'm inspired that so many young people and people who are seeking knowledge take this opportunity to try to learn a little bit more about the Constitution. And I hope that our talk this morning will do a couple of things. I approach the Constitution as a topic from a Wolfram standpoint. What's in it for me? Now, I am certainly an American citizen, as are most, if not all of you. I am a Missouri resident and intend to be here for a while. The things I do have some permanency. They have a place, not only in my lives, but the lives of others. And that's the way it is for each of you. When we talk about big topics like the Constitution, right? I mean, it's something that's so common and so familiar, but at the same time, so wide-reaching, with implications that affect us on a daily basis. It brings to mind for me a term called hermeneutics. You may have run across it in your studies, or maybe even elementary school. The idea is that you can take a word or a concept that existed, say, in 1624, and bring it forward to today. And because of the context, the placement, the utilization of the word, the things that were taking place in people's hearts and minds, and just the common customs of the time, you can have a much different outcome, a much different understanding of what that term could mean. So, I mean, imagine in 1624, people are on the Mayflower, everybody's twerking, right? No, nobody was twerking on the Mayflower, right? So that's a whole new term. It doesn't necessarily apply to hermeneutics, but it just goes to show you that things change. The Constitution, though, is a lasting document that has seen some change, and thank goodness, because without that, I would be very afraid, not only for our system of government, but for us as a group of people, an organization. So, as I was saying, though, I approach the Constitution from a what's in it for me standpoint. But in order to do that, I have to relate it to my life in a number of different ways. I think that we're going to do that in at least two different ways today. But let me set the context for how I view the Constitution. I'm part of a socioeconomic, political, quasi-political, not really political, humanitarian club or organization. It was started over 100 years ago because the founders of the organization were tired, and frankly, I think many of them were kind of scared for what kind of society we were becoming. They were tired of seeing people murdered, yanked out of places of public accommodation, stores, the street, their homes, fields, by mobs or small numbers of people bound together with rope, wire, all manner of device, and hung. Sometimes they were burned, mutilated, beaten before, during, or after the hanging. And that includes instances where folks would gather bringing picnic baskets, angry mobs, or perhaps just a few mad people in the street when this occurred. But that's why the NAACP formed over 100 years ago. Today, we're still concerned about murders. Trayvon Martin is deeply on our hearts, as it may be yours. And the sad part is that there are hundreds of Trayvons, and they come in all different colors and sexes, all different religions. But as part of our work now, the organization tries to stay current on events, on the latest legal cases, on legislation that may affect us. Because it's not that far ago, a long time ago, that people were being murdered. And I don't know whether it's because many of the media outlets that we have an opportunity to watch, whether it's on TV, cable, or print media, some of them do a very good job. I'd like to recognize Mr. Bob Watson, a reporter here today. He is with the News Tribune. He's taking some pictures, and I'm happy that he's here. Mr. Watson does an excellent job of supporting the community and ensuring that important stories are available to be reported on. But some other reporters spend a lot of time focusing on Miley Cyrus, trying to figure out where she learned to twerk and all that stuff. And so you miss some of the news. You have to really struggle at some points to get a nice understanding about what's happening and why. And so I thought it'd be fitting today if I did a little twerking, just to bring it all around. No, I'm not going to do any twerking. No. I will do some legal explanations and talk about some important cases, things that made our country important. And fortunately, Mr. Watson's here, so I don't have to dance, and that's better for everybody. You've heard of different organizations like the NAACP, the ACLU, the Missouri Association for Social Welfare, and many others. The truth is that some of them are known as the Lions, the Eagles, the American Legion. These are all civic organizations. And at their core, the idea is that we want to make America a better place. It's the backbone of America, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. You see, there are a lot of people that are going to tell you that the Constitution is the end-all, be-all. That all we have to do is have this piece of paper. By the way, anybody have a smartphone? iPhone? Android? Yeah. You know you can get a free copy of the Constitution as an app. I say that for two reasons. One, I was going to stop by the Secretary of State's office today and pick up some Constitution so we could all have a copy and take it home and refer to it if we wanted to. And they said due to budget cuts, we were entitled to about 25. Okay, that's not, we have more than 25 people here. And since it's free, I figured we'd just do the app deal. So if you want to download the app now or later, let me tell you, you don't have to keep it on your phone forever, but it does have the Constitution. I mean, it really is the framework for our entire system of government. But I was saying, lots of people talk about the Constitution as if you can have that app, you can have this information, a piece of paper, a booklet, and present it like it's the wrist bracelets that Wonder Woman used to wear, or like Superman's cape that's kind of some kind of flame retardant deal. It's not that way. The Constitution is not self-activating. It doesn't, get bigger with the bad water. You and I, our communities, our society, has to be actively engaged in order to make it work. I think about some of the movies that we see from time to time. One being Coming to America. Anybody see that movie? I like that movie. I'm gonna call him Cassius Clay. His mama named him Cassius Clay. That's what I'm gonna call him. It's one of my favorite lines. You ever wonder though, what would make an African prince come to the United States? I mean, he was rich, he had land, he apparently was looking to get married, and there were beautiful women there. He had a loving support family, a support structure in his family. And I know somebody out there saying, well, that was a fictional character. Eddie Murphy made him up to make the movie come together. But the reality is that even though that was a fictional character, there are people who are the sons and daughters of humanity from around the world that seek to be in America for what it has to offer. And when we think about what it has to offer, it's not just, MTV and cotton candy. We have a firm economic system, one based on the principle that if you work, you get to eat. Capitalism at its core. We have a political system where everybody gets to participate. And we have, better than that, a dream. And, we've been through a couple of election cycles and folks have talked about, I want some change. I have hope. We can do it. That is the essence of the American spirit. But you can sum it up by saying we want to have the American dream. That we want our children to have a better life than we had. That we're willing to work to ensure that we can have a better future. You're evidence of that. If you didn't care about education, some will do it just for the sake of being educated, for being an intellectual, for having ideas of your own and being able to better express those things. Others of us, and I join the latter group from time to time, received an education so I could go out and do something that I felt was a calling for me that I needed to do. That American dream is open to everyone. It's yours, it's mine, and it's not something that's given with a birthright or any other piece of paper other than citizenship. And we're going to touch on that in a second too. So I'm going to claim this American dream as being mine. Today has a special importance to me, and I hope it does to all of you. I like it better than the 4th of July. I like it better than Juneteenth, frankly. I'm not going to compare it to Christmas. It's not a religious holiday. But fundamentally, as a human being in the United States, Constitution Day is a day that I look forward to every year because it gives us an opportunity to talk about our core values, things that allow our humanity and dignity to be preserved, whether we're here in this room, in a street, in a jail, in a courtroom, or any other place that we may find ourselves. The Constitution is the one thing that sets us apart from being slaves and being free. Right? It's the difference between being robbed. Anybody ever been robbed? Somebody take your stuff out of your house, out of your pocket, out of your hand? Yeah. That's a horrible feeling to have somebody take something from you. That's what taxation is if you don't get to vote. And it's one of the reasons that America has everybody that gets a vote. And that was at least how it started. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Somebody out there is also saying, you've been going a few minutes now, Chapel. You haven't talked anything about the Constitution. I haven't learned anything new that I didn't know about the Constitution. And that may be true. You may leave here today with no new facts about the Constitution, with no new concepts about why the Constitution is important in your lives. But if we spend a few minutes today memorializing the importance of it in our lives, I think we'll all be better for it. In America we have this thing called law. It's composed of rules, and the laws are made up by all sorts of legislative bodies. That's the legislature that sits not too far away from here in the Big Dome, the one in D.C. We have a city council. Anybody here from the city council? No, we've got a couple of Lincoln folks. Not yet. Maybe you guys will be on the city council later. We have decisions made by various courts. We have bureaucrats that create regulations to implement laws. And some of those legal questions that we are going to look at today arose when people challenged or questioned laws. Now the Constitution, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, is long enough that I would probably get dry in the throat and you would get a little, deaf in the ear, and we'd run out of time. But I'm going to select some key issues that I think affect us all. It was pointed out to me at one point that some of these issues relate primarily to race, and that race is an artificial structure, that there is no such thing as races among humans, that we happen to be different colors, but there's one human race. And so perhaps I ought to reorganize or restructure my talk about the Constitution, because apparently I'm talking about a figment. But this figment of our imagination inundates our lives. As Americans, it has controlled the way that generations have lived, and is likely to do so for generations in the future. The primary reason that I want to focus on race is because it's not whether you are or not a color, whether you are or not a sex, or not a particular age or religion, or any other artificial division that people use to keep from recognizing other folks. The point is that we all live here together, and the Constitution sets the basic rules, the framework that we have to use in order to do that. So let's talk about it. The Constitution of the United States of America, who counts? By the way, there's no heading that says who counts. It's Article 1, Section 2. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may include within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So who counts as an American? Right? This is as it was written. Well, let's see. All free people. So at the time, that would probably not be people of color necessarily, although there were some free people of color. They decided not to include Indians because they were not taxed. You know that Indians and Native Americans, as we call them now, I am one, at least in part, are domestic or domestic sovereigns. They have their own nation, separate and apart from the United States, but they are certainly a part of the United States. They weren't included then because they weren't taxed. 3/5 of all other persons. Well, all other persons would probably be everybody that was a slave. And now that was just for counting. It wasn't like you could go to the poll and say, I got my 3/5 vote. The reality is that was just how we're going to count people. All right. Well, when can a limit be made, and what about the taxes? There's still no real heading about that. Article 1, Section 9 reflects a compromise on slavery. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 per person. What? Yeah. Essentially, what we're saying is there is a tacit recognition that the federal government has the ability to control the activities of the states. But because the states weren't so ready to agree to that, they said, we're going to wait a couple of years before we impose this. It'll be more palatable, and it'll be better, right? Just like the federal government can control activities in the states, and there's an argument for federalism. These are the Federalist Papers. We could spend weeks on those. But let's just leave it at, if you can tax, you can destroy. The federal government asserted its right to be able to tax people, at that time, slaves. And that was the law until 1808. Article 4, Section 2 represents another compromise between free and slave states. It prohibits slaves from obtaining freedom simply by successfully reaching a free state. It reads, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping to another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim to the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Article 4, Section 2. That was the basis for returning people who had escaped slavery in one way or another, or just left an area where slavery was, for a free state to be returned as property to those people. Article 5, Section 2 sets out a process for amending the Constitution, but precludes amendment of Articles 1, Section 2, and 9 prior to 1808, right? That deal was already cut. We're not going to revisit it. And this was another slave compromise. The ratification of the Constitution was made dependent upon adoption of the Bill of Rights. Anybody looked at the Bill of Rights lately? I have them hanging on my wall. And, well, I guess they're in a box. They used to be on my wall in my office. I left my office. So there are 10 amendments, or at least the first 10 have got nothing to do with the issue of race. We talked all about everything else. Along with the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence is often cited as one of the nation's seminal documents. but it doesn't refer specifically to race, but many find difficulty reconciling its pronouncement that all men are created equal with the fact that slavery was allowed in such a young nation. Did anybody else have a problem with that? Did it seem that we were being a little hypocritical, right? Saying one thing, doing something else? That's a flexibility allowed by the Constitution. But the good news is that it allowed us to do something else later. So what is within the jurisdiction of the central government, the federal government? That was a question raised by the compromises and was resolved in the determination of the cases that we're going to review, just a little bit. But before we get there, and we aren't going to cover that many cases, just maybe one or two. The Fugitive Slave Act, it was legislation that acted upon Article 4, Section 2. It said that runaway slaves had to be sent back to their owners, regardless of whether they were found to be in slave states or free states. The Act provided for an extensive legal structure for the enforcement and of the requirements of Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, and laid out penalties for those impeding its enforcement. It reflected a growing conflict between opponents and proponents of slavery in the United States. Wow, that's a whole bunch of stuff about slavery and who's free and not free, and a little bit about who's getting taxed, and who's an American and who's not. By the way, those amendments are still in there, right? So even though we're doing something different, there aren't any more slaves, so to speak, at least in a legalized fashion in the United States, those amendments are still there. They're still part of the Constitution. But let's talk about when we were slaves, what changed, and how we might go back on some levels. There was a case called Dred Scott versus Sanford. Anybody studied that? Yeah. Does anybody know where that case took place at? Where? St. Louis, that's right. That's right. That's a Missouri institution. Missouri played a pivotal role in and some would argue, in the formation of the United States and the architecture that our country has now. Mind you, it wasn't like we would remember home, some nice thing that our parents did for us. This is more in the lines of like a bad memory that came out to be better a long time later, right? Now, has everybody bring their Constitution binder? Yeah? No? I have this. I lost my tab. I've been carrying it around a little bit. Seems like I need it now more than ever. The other misconception, though, and I know we're talking a few hundred years ago, we'll bring us to date here pretty soon, is that this is some kind of a dead document. I remember when I went to law school, I had just started down there at Tulane in New Orleans. If you haven't been in New Orleans, you should go. But I was down there and managed to make it to class, and I had Professor Wargan for constitutional law, and he started off with a much different recitation about constitutional law. He started actually reading the Constitution, which was really slow, especially at about 8:30 in the morning. The Constitution is probably more useful and alive today and will need more attention this decade and maybe the next than, I don't know, generations have seen in a while. And I hesitate, but I'll say it, even with the Civil Rights Movement, the changes that we are watching occur now could fundamentally shift what it means to be an American, our ability to participate in society, and the futures not only of us, we really don't matter. If you think about it, in 60, 80 years, we're all going to be dead anyway. Some of us less. But what about our kids, right? And if you don't have children yet, wait till you get one. It's a heck of a motivating factor. The Dred Scott case was decided in 1857. It said essentially that Dred Scott, who'd been born a slave, he traveled around with his army surgeon and managed to end up in a free portion of the Louisiana Territory. For the rest of us Missourians, that was Missouri, right? That's where he ended up. And Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that since slavery was outlawed in the free territory, he had become a free man while he was there. And that once free, always free. Can't take me back. The argument was roundly rejected by the Missouri Supreme Court. But Scott and his white supporters managed to get this case in the federal court. Now let's hold there for a second. Remember how we were talking a little earlier about how it's so important for us to stand together, united in humanity, regardless regardless of our official divisions, right? That's been going on a long time. And if you look at the pivotal events in American history that have allowed humanity to transcend the needy aspects of individuals, you'll see that we all did it together. But they go on, and they say that where the issue was simply whether a slave had standing, that was the issue in federal court. That is, the legal right to sue. So the first question the Supreme Court had to decide, the United States Supreme Court, was whether it had jurisdiction. And if Scott had standing, then the court had jurisdiction, and the justices could go on to decide the merits of the claim, right? So, the way courts work, when you show up, everybody knows you by your name. Your names are on the pleas. It's the only place in government, by the way, where they're actually going to recognize you as an individual. If you go to the legislature, you know, unless you've been a murder victim or the victim of some heinous crime and they name a law after you, which is not good because they still don't know you, it's just a memory of you. Or if you go to the governor's office, the executive branch, or the president's office, you know, some individuals get to talk with those important people, but they have limited time, and so they have to decide how they're going to do that. Most of the time, people like us don't really get known by name in the executive branch, whatever level of government. But the courts, any court, has to know you by name. They're going to address whatever issue it is that you have, and they're going to do their best to do it. But one issue they always ask is, do we have the ability to do that? And that's where they decided this case. They said that Scott did not. They said he was a slave, and that he could not exercise, get this, the prerogative, right? The prerogative. He didn't have the choice. He couldn't form the thought of his own volition of a free citizen to sue in federal court. And that should have been the end of the case. But Chief Justice Taney and some other Southern sympathizers hoped that a definitive ruling would settle the issue of slavery in the territories once and for all. So they went on to rule that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional, since Congress could not forbid citizens from taking their property, i.e. slaves, in any territory owned by the United States, as slaves, Taney ruled, was property, nothing more, and could never be a citizen. Now, they got a word for that, or a term. Anybody know what it is? I'll tell you. It's one frequently used by conservatives today, judicial activism, right? The Supreme Court was trying to solve a problem that was really not within their purview to solve. They were at that time considered, actually I'm going to read you just a short passage from the case, but before we get there, the idea is that the Supreme Court was going to solve a problem that they felt the legislature, you know, Congress, could not. That the executive branch was not effective in dealing with. And that was probably their role in government. Many people, I think all scholars would probably agree that the Supreme Court does not set policy in that way. But in little incremental ways, courts do decide how laws are going to be implemented. And so by determining how they will be implemented, it determines what the law really means. So I could write red, white, and blue in my law, and if they say orange, green, and yellow, it's a complete different thing. That's what happened in Dred Scott. Rather than following the law, they decided to take it upon themselves to do something else. I'll give you just a little flavor of Taney's decision. The words people of the United States and citizens are synonymous terms and mean the same thing. They both describe the political body who, according to our republican institutions, form of sovereignty and who hold the power and conduct the government through their representatives. The question before us is whether the class of persons described in the plea and abatement, that's the piece of paper, the complaint, the petition file, compose a portion of this people, and are they constituent members of this sovereignty. We think they are not, and they are not included, and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges of that instrument, the Constitution. Wow. Just like that. With about 8 lines of text. They said that a whole section of humanity can never be citizens. The great thing about the Constitution, it allows for some error, right? So, sometime later, there came what amendment? Anybody know the number of the amendment that eliminated slavery? 13. I heard it out there, that's right. The Constitution declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, whereby the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That formally abolished slavery in the United States. It was passed by Congress January 31st, 1865, and ratified by the states on December 6th, 1865. Soon to follow, we had the 14th Amendment, simply stating that all persons born in the United States are naturalized citizens. No state can abridge the privilege and immunities of citizenship, and nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. True or false? Justice and equality for all is in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. True? False? False, right. Doesn't say that anywhere. The 14th Amendment is as close as you get, right? It says simply that we're all going to be treated the same, that we all have the same rights and privileges and immunities of citizenship. Those are guaranteed by the Constitution. And then nobody can take those away from us without due process of law. Now, I'll just tell you, I spent 6 years, the last 6 years, as an administrative law judge here in the state of Missouri. Traveled all over the state, listening to all kinds of disputes between individuals and organizations and businesses and the state regarding licensure, regarding taxation, permits, a bunch of other issues, including personnel matters. As part of the executive branch, we didn't have the ability to determine statutes or laws unconstitutional, right? But we were charged with ensuring that due process was followed when it came to every case. Due process, by the way, is a constitutional concern. It's a constitutionally framed issue, made probably, well, some would say clear, some would say less clear, by court decisions. The idea being that it's important to remember where you're at when you're asking for your constitutional protections. And do you have a right to protection of those those issues? So let's bring it all home, just quickly. Anybody hear about what's going on in New York? I know it's a big city, there's a lot going on there. Anybody from New York? You know, they've got a deal over there, or had one, called Stop and Frisk. Now, do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Apparently, the mayor, Bloomberg, thought it would be a fantastic idea that we, being the city, and all its police officers, should uniformly have a policy that they're going to stop people based on color. And that's how they were going to combat crime. You know, apparently they felt like they had a lot of people of color that were committing a lot of crime, and that as citizens, that's something that we should be prepared to address. And the best way to address that is a preemptive search. So before you commit a crime, you could be deemed a criminal. Actually, you were, because you were stopped based on the color of your skin. Recently, there was a fantastic decision rendered by Judge Shinlin, a great justice in her own right, or a judge in her own right, federal court judge. She wrote 195 pages about why stopping and frisking people based solely on skin color is a constitutional violation. I have some excerpts from that opinion, about 60 pages worth. We have some time. I'm going to read them. I have some excerpts, though, where she talks about it, and I just want to share a few of those with you. One, to show you, first, that the Constitution is still interpreted by courts all over the country and should be used by people like you and me whenever we have a grievance against the government, against another individual, to ensure that our society can remain intact. So let's start here. The third paragraph, it says, plaintiffs, blacks and Hispanic, were stopped. Argue that the NYPD's use of stop and frisk violated their constitutional rights in two ways. That they were stopped without a legal basis in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Okay. And that they were targeted for stops because of their race in violation of the 14th Amendment. Plaintiffs do not seek to end the use of stop and frisk, but rather they argue that it must be reformed to comply with the constitutional limits. Two such limits are paramount here. First, that all stops be based on reasonable suspicion as defined by the Supreme Court of the United States. And second, that stops be conducted in a racially neutral manner. Wow. Wouldn't you think that would be the way that we would do it anyway? Anybody here a criminal justice major? Yeah? You guys should seriously think about going on and being lawyers. If you get a chance, if you want to. The idea that a jurisdiction, people pay taxes in the city of New York to establish government, and government is supposed to provide for the people. And they came up with an idea that directly assaulted the constitutional rights of a huge number of their citizens, of the members of their city, the people that live there. They did it on color, and they did it without a reasonable suspicion. Now, those are two issues which have been long settled in American law. But let's see how this played out, right? Because you're thinking, you stop somebody, maybe it's just you just stop that person. What does that really mean? Anybody ever been stopped? No, I haven't. Yeah, what does that feel like? You're on your way someplace, and you get pulled over, right? You're walking someplace, you're told, come here, and you have to, because you know what might happen, right? So, the court found these following facts to be uncontested. Because it's hard. Imagine millions of people this happened to, right? Millions, over the course of years. She found that between 2004 and 2012, the New York Police Department conducted over 4.4 million Terry stops. A Terry stop is where you stop and ask for identification, and you determine, if there are any other issues that you want to address. There's some more requirements, but we'll leave it at that for now. The number of stops per year rose sharply from 314,000 in 2004 to 686,000 in 2011. 52% of all the stops were followed by a protective frisk for weapons. A protective frisk for weapons is where the officer makes a subjective determination in that officer's mind that this person may be a risk, right? They make that usually after they stop the person, and then they pat them down. A weapon was only found after 1.5% of those frisks. In other words, in 98.5% of the 2.3 million frisks, no weapons were found at all. Right? 98.5% of the time. 8% of all stops led to a search into the stopped person's clothing, ostensibly based on the officer's feeling an object during the frisk that the suspect thought the suspect may have a weapon, or immediately perceived to be contraband other than a weapon. Now, in 9% of those searches, the felt object was in fact a weapon. So 91% of the time that they thought they felt a weapon, it really wasn't. Apparently, it's really hard to find out or feel what a weapon is. Like maybe guns don't feel like guns, maybe they feel like jelly donuts. Or that's 91% of the time it was not effective. In 14% of those searches, the felt object was in fact contraband. And so 86% of the time, they were looking for contraband, like drugs or something else. 86% of the time, it was not effective. In 6% of all stops that resulted in an arrest, and 6% resulted in summons. And that leaves 88% of the 4.4 million people who were stopped with no further law enforcement action. 52% of the 4.4 million stops, the persons stopped were black. 52%. 31% of the people were Hispanic and 10% were white. In 2010, New York City's residential population looked a lot like this. 23% black, 29% Hispanic, and 33% white. In 23% of the stops of the blacks and 24% of the stops of the Hispanics, the officer was recorded as using force. That's almost 1 in 4, right? The number for whites was about 17%. Weapons were seized in 1% of the stops of the blacks, 1.1% of the stops in Hispanics, and 1.4% of the stops in whites. Contraband and other weapons were seized, and it goes on and on and on, but I think you get the flavor. Essentially, a lot of resources, tax money, was being spent to stop American citizens as they went about their daily business. It was based on color, and it was without a reasonable suspicion. that something was going on with that person. Their objective, their stated objective, was to crack down on crime. But the evidence also shows that between 2004 and 2011, the incidence of stops increased, even as crime was going down, right? So that argument fails on its face. With respect to the plaintiff's 14th Amendment claim, I reject the testimony of the city's expert that the race of a crime suspect is the appropriate benchmark of measuring racial bias in stops. You know what that means? That means that somebody said out loud, right, in a court of law, offering testimony to a federal judge in front of a jury, that people of certain colors commit more crime than people of other colors, right? The court rejected that testimony, and I'll tell you just by way of a little story. In Texas, there was a federal judge there who recently said the same thing in her comments to a group of lawyers. And you're familiar with the term outing? They outed her, right? She had 4 years. They went back and looked at the statistics, been sentencing minorities to stiffer sentences for longer periods of time over less important, or if we can say trivial or lower crimes than their white counterparts. The feeling that certain people, just by their genetic makeup, having a darker pigmentation, could be worse people, or categorically are worse people, was one of the ideas that was spread when slavery was around, right? The importance of the Constitution, the 4th and 14th Amendment, is that we as American citizens have the right to go where we would like to go. We can go to Harris's Pizza, have a slice. We used to be able to go to the Ramada Theater. It's closed down now, but now we can go to the Capitol Theater, right? We've got all kinds of choices that we can do. But the truth is that if people erect artificial strictures, in this case, it was one imposed by the city through its police. I don't know how it could be any more real than that. To limit the movement, limit the ability of citizens to go about their daily lives, infringing upon their rights as human beings to be safe in their persons. If those kinds of things can go on, you have to ask yourself, are we really free, right? Because freedom is not an absolute. Either you're in chains or you're not. The truth is that it may be a sliding scale. That if you're a certain person and you can only go certain places, the Constitution, at its essence, does not apply the same to you as it does to other people. That's not right. 14th Amendment says it applies to everybody. Let's think about it in another way, though. You may have seen that in the state of Missouri, as many other states, have introduced legislation to change the way that voting is done. They call it voter ID, right? They want every voter to have an ID. And one of the local politicians, not a local one, one of the Missouri politicians said, well, you have to have an ID if you want to rent a video from Blockbuster. By the way, nobody goes to Blockbuster anymore. But renting a video from Blockbuster is not a constitutionally protected right. Sure, we all have a right to go in there, but their requirements for renting a video are quite different than requirements to vote, right? Nowhere does it say in the Constitution you have to have a photo ID. Can you imagine when they wrote the Constitution? There may have been a few photos. I'm not sure when photos came around, but the Polaroid didn't really get started until the 50s and 60s. Now we've got digital cameras, it's no big deal. But we got Facebook too, and people can steal your picture. My point being that Missouri, like other states, is treading dangerously close to creating a law that would allow some people to vote and some people not to. And how do you know that's so? Their argument is we're going to give everybody an ID. There are senior citizens in the United States, some in Missouri, who do not have any ID. Literally. They don't have birth certificates. They don't have driver's licenses. They may have a social security card. We all know that does not have a picture that goes with it. There are children, right, who don't have ID. Some of those children grow up in places where they don't need a driver's license, either because they have a car or public transportation is better. They may not be involved with an institution. and grow up into adults where they don't have the classic driver's ID. They don't have the college ID that we have now. Now, you can say that we're going to give all those people free IDs. Now, when we say give, what do you mean give? Because the government doesn't really give stuff. I pay my taxes, you pay your taxes, we pay taxes to state and federal government, we pay sales taxes, and those monies are used as we see fit because they are used by our representatives on measures that we approve, either through a direct ballot or through retaining those representatives or getting somebody to change it. The problem with allowing large segments, and this is what many people say is going to happen, poor people, people without cars, people without transportation, people who are literally fighting to survive, may or may not be on public assistance, are going to have a hard time getting IDs. Low-wage workers, more of those in America now than there ever have been. Low-wage workers are going to have a hard time getting them, A, because you can work 40 hours a week and still be in poverty. B, because you have to take time off to go downtown to get this license, and if you've ever dealt with a bureaucrat, you know that it is at their pleasure, not your leisure, right? And C, seniors across the United States, in different states, would have a very hard time. One, because if they don't drive, how is it going to take them to get this ID? Do they have the money to get the ID? It becomes a socio-economic issue that draws lines between who is a real American, those that vote and pay taxes, versus the other Americans, those that just pay taxes, right? And we already decided that if you are paying taxes but don't get to vote, that is the equivalent of being robbed, right? It's one of the principles that we as Americans hold dear, that if you pay your taxes, you get to say. Otherwise, it's just not fair. Now, third, I'm going to give this to you, and then we'll conclude. We may have a minute or two for questions if we have any, and I'd love some. Not that I'm a constitutional scholar, but I sure have an opinion about some of the issues. The difference between a backyard brawl and a sanctioned bout, right? If you watch boxing, any other organized sporting event, it's a contest. There's no given as to who's going to win. The matches are formed sometimes by promoters who want to see what the issue is going to be. For example, if you look at Plessy versus Ferguson, there were people who found Mr. Plessy, noticed that he had a particular issue, and thought that he would be a good person to take to court to see if they could win on the facts of the case. Just like that case, there are 100 other situations, 1,000, perhaps 1,000,000 other situations going on, right? If I fall out with my neighbor because his tree is dropping pears on my land, and I go over there and I punch him in the eye, or throw some of those pears through his window, or something worse, I'm going to jail, pretty much. That's the way it's going to end up. You know, if I take him to court and I say, your pears are damaging my land, or I slipped and fell on one of your pears and I hurt myself, or one of my guests did, then that's allowed. The value of the American Constitution is that it prevents us from using the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, as the final arbiter of what it means to be an American. Because if you're dead, it really doesn't matter, right? Once you're dead, the constitutional provisions no longer apply to you. There's no dead people section. So we have to keep everybody alive as long as we can. And I say that tongue-in-cheek. We can't have people going out and killing each other for a number of reasons. It's inhumane, you're going to cause a lot of harm, you're going to destroy the tax base, right? We're all taxpayers. Keep killing people, nobody's going to be left to pay taxes. And what are you going to do with the dead people? So the Constitution allows us an opportunity to engage one another on a civil level. It hasn't always been perfect. Sometimes it had some of us sitting at the kiddie table, others sitting at the adult table. It had groups of people making decisions for large groups of people who had no say, but still had to pay or work. It's not self-executing. You can't just add water and have, boom, a bucket of constitutional rights. You got to go out and you got to protect them yourselves. They're your rights. If you don't protect them, somebody else may take advantage of you, of people you love, take or destroy your property, and leave you wondering what happened. A story near and dear to me, I have a friend who lives out in California. He knew his parents, or know his parents very well. He had a car, had some nice rims on his car. Some other kid in the neighborhood comes along, jacks his car up, leaves it on bricks, takes his rims, and then has the nerve to ride around on his rims in the same neighborhood, right? This kid found a gun someplace, went and hijacked his rims back. Kind of like what they say OJ did, right? He had some of his personal effects, he went in a hotel room and took them back. They were his. The law doesn't really care too much about that. You can't use force or violence in most situations and expect to get away with it. I won't touch on the stand your ground trademark murder situation. That kind of thing destroys society. It gets people hurt, and in the long run, no good can come of it. The young man ended up spending 6 years in a federal penitentiary. 26 now, trying to figure out what he's going to do with the rest of his life. He can't vote. He's a felon. Nobody wants you as a felon. There's a box on most applications for employment. Are you a felon? Have you ever been arrested? Have you ever been convicted? Right? He's a second-class citizen. Now that's a topic for another speech. But the Constitution, if used appropriately, can prevent that. It says that he could have called the authorities, they could have taken this individual that stole his rims, put them in jail. There could have been a court case to determine whether or not they were innocent or not. He may have gotten his property back, likely that he would have. And it doesn't have to just be criminal stuff. It's civil stuff too. You know, you go into a store, people won't let you shop. That's not right. Based on the color of your skin. Kind of like a New York style anti-commerce deal. Well, you have a right to shop wherever you want to. You apply for a job, and they won't let you work. Say that your color, sex, race, religion, age is not what they're looking for. They don't want that. Now, rarely will anybody ever write you a note, but you may feel when it happens. Or you have a car wreck. Somebody just runs into you. It doesn't matter what happens. You have a right to your life, liberty, and property. And the Constitution is the framework that has all the laws, federal and state and local, that allow you to protect that. My final point is going to be that if you don't protect your rights, nobody else will. Now you may say, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not this, I'm not that. You know, some of you have not graduated college yet. Doesn't matter. You can do it, you can find people that will help you, and it's your obligation as an American citizen. So as you leave here today, think about Constitution Day as a day where you stand up for yourselves, where every American ought to stand up for themselves and make sure that they get all that's due. Nothing more, just the respect and dignity that every human's entitled to, the property that you currently hold, and that you will be getting in the future. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. I'll take some questions. Any questions? I'll take some. Yes? Please. Yeah.
You were talking about the New York case of Stop Church.
Yes.
And they explicitly said that they were using color as a, and the Supreme Court has decided that no matter how discrepant the numbers are, unless someone explicitly says that they're using color, it's still constitutional. So I'm wondering if the New York case is going to have any impact on, let's say, happening nationwide this time.
That is a fantastic question. I didn't touch on it even though I had it posted in my notes that said this is a roadmap for some issues that Missouri faces. Who knows that Missouri has a real driving while black issue? Anybody aware of that? That if you're a minority, a person of color, maybe even stop, that you are sometimes 50 to 100, 125% more likely to be stopped than anybody else. That's just driving down the road. That doesn't speak to infractions. And by the way, people of color have less infractions according to the data compared by the Attorney General. And so to get back to your question, what about those cases? Because for a long time it was thought that only individual cases could be brought and proved but you need such large swaths of data in order to show that there's a pattern of unreasonable search and seizure, or stop and frisk, or being pulled over. I'm hoping that this case will have a roadmap and allow a new application of precedents set down by the Supreme Court. The idea that somebody has to write on a piece of paper, I'm doing this because they're black, because they're Hispanic, because they're a woman, because they're this, is just ridiculous. You have to be able to look at circumstantial evidence. We do that all the time, and with many issues of law, there's no reason that it shouldn't be the same here. Oh, I'm sorry, thank you.
Bringing back up the New York case again, you mentioned the statistics, and there are social scientists argue that we need to stop taking these statistics on racial lines, on these manufactured lines, whether they're GLBT, whether they're race, whether they're sex, because what we're doing is we're further institutionalizing this concept of division, and that we can't ever move beyond our artificial division lines if we continue to look at everything through the scope of race, sex, sexual orientation, sexual identity. What do you think of that?
You know, that's a heck of a concept, because just recently I was confronted with a group of 5-year-olds that were playing. They already understand sex and race probably about as well as we do. Different girl or boy, different skin color, maybe different hair. Those issues are going to be debated a long time. But I think that we as adults better start laying a framework about what's acceptable in terms of conversations we can have about that, how we're going to address those issues, and maybe even try to eradicate them as much as possible. I love the idea that you could have small kids that would not know the difference, would not care about the difference between this and that. And I use small kids as an example because if we can't get the nice pure heart of a child shaped in the right direction, it makes me wonder about where we as adults are going to end up. As long as we don't internalize those statistics, I'm saying, like here, allow an expert to get on the stand and actually be called an expert in anything and say that based on color I can tell who's going to commit a crime or who's more likely to commit a crime, I think we'll be okay. One more question? I'm going bonus round. Hey, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.